in honor of Burt Bacharach's passing. What the world? Anyway, so our topic today, when this video comes out, they'll wonder what that was all about, is Places to Pray, the Evolution of Inspirationist Worship Spaces, 1714 to 2023. Now, it's really not a great title now that I think about it, because they don't really evolve all that much. The Middle Ebenezer Meeting House and this building that we're in, that we still use today, are very much the same. So it's not like there's been a great deal of change. But I want to trace basically every large meeting house that we ever built, from Germany to Ebenezer and here to Iowa, as I step over here, and how they were built and when they were built, and some of the characteristics and why they are the way that they are. Including, I'm going to have to mention the one in the middle. So we start out, die Wahre Inspirationsgemeinde, or the True Inspiration Community in Germany, founded in 1714. As Lanny covered in his presentation on Paul Nagel last week, they were house churches. They met very informally in homes, and one of the homes is this house in Himbach, which may or may not actually be E.L. Gruber's house. We're not 100% sure on that. But the emphasis was on a simplicity in worship. In like a lot of radical pietist groups at the time, there was a strong testimony, if you will, against steeple houses, against these worldly churches that were fancy, and there were a lot of money was spent on decoration and statuary and beautiful paintings and that sort of thing, that they felt distracted you from your focus on what was truly important, which was the worship experience itself. And that's true not only of our group, but of the Moravians, and also of groups like the Quakers. They all come from the same tradition. So in Germany, they're really meeting in homes. They're scattered around. There are certain centers in different parts of the German states where you're going to see a lot of inspirationists living in the same village, but they're going to meet in somebody's house. Then they start moving to estates. They start congregating, first of all, at the Ronneburg Castle, and this is in the 1720s. And of course, as you may know, they're expelled from the Ronneburg 2 times, I believe. If not, don't correct me. The second time in the 1750s, when the congregation has to move to Gelnhausen and later to Lieblos. When they returned, the Moravian Church had actually been occupying the Ronneburg, and that's one of the reasons why they had to move. And while they were away, Count Zinzendorf of the Moravians built a meeting room at the Ronneburg. It's literally called the Zinzendorf Bau, the Zinzendorf construction, which is on the main courtyard of the Ronneburg castle. And you have to go up some steps, but this is the room. And we know that that is the room that they worshipped in the Ronneburg. It's both in the local tradition, and also there are 2 mentions of it in Christian Metz's diary, where he describes that you go up this little flight of steps to go in the meeting room. And then another time he has a dream where he said he was standing in the courtyard and Jesus appeared and threw a stone hard against the wall of the building, and it whizzed past his ear. And he said, so my words will bounce out of these people's heads, that they won't pay attention. So for that reason, we know that that is the room. And today, if you go in there, there's a small, or at least there was a small exhibit on Amana. They took a lot from the Moravians, I believe, because you're looking at these illustrations of Moravians. Moravians are a related group. They're led by Count Zinzendorf. Of course, they lived at the Ronneburg. Later, they left the Ronneburg and they built a planned community called Herrenhag, which we also would later occupy. And they had some very interesting history while they were at the Hoehnle, and we will not get into that because this is a family audience. But eventually that they will come to North America and they'll settle in Pennsylvania and North Carolina. Think Winston-Salem, and Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, Nazareth, Pennsylvania. So are all Moravian communities. But the Moravians in their worship were very similar to the way we know our Versammlungssaal, or our churches. For example, you've got the men on the one side, the women on the other. You have a row of elders facing the congregation, and in the center of that row of elders, there is a cloth-covered table, which is where the presiding elder sits. So exactly the same. And as you're going to see in some of the later pictures, even the same benches. I mean, literally, they look like our benches exactly. So my theory is that in some ways they may have been copying some of the Moravian designs, or the Moravians may have been copying them. But definitely there is a relationship between the two groups. And of course, as we know from our history, at one point in time there was an attempt to kind of do a merger between the Inspirationists and the Moravians that broke on basically on a disagreement with Count Zinzendorf and Johann Friedrich Roth. So anyway, the Inspirationists started congregating together on several large estates in the 1820s and 1830s. And these had all been former religious communities. In other words, Catholic convents and monasteries, because the monasteries and convents had been lost in Germany during, at least in Hessen, during the Protestant Reformation. So they were meeting in these buildings. We don't know exactly how, probably in large rooms, but we do know at Hoehnle that they probably again used the Moravian meeting hall there, which is at the top of what's known as the Grafenhaus, which is one of the two buildings that's still standing. And it's this magnificent two-story space with dormer windows. It's probably the grandest space our people ever used for worship. But you can see the benches. They're very similar to our style of bench. And here we go into some more Moravian meeting houses. This is the Moravian church that was built at Littis, Pennsylvania, by Philadelphia. The Moravian meeting house at Bethlehem. And I mean, these are literally Amana benches. They're varnished, but that's the only difference. And then up in the upper right is the Moravian church, the big Moravian meeting house at Neuwied. And that's significant because Christian Metz and several other important early community leaders lived in Neuwied, actually grew up in Neuwied, and would have been probably familiar with that meeting house and with the Moravian community there. These are, of course, the benches as we know and love them and have suffered through sitting on for 150 years, to be honest. There is a diagram of how they're put together. They're actually pretty complicated pieces of furniture. There's something like 6 different angles in the leg supports, for example. So pretty complex pieces of carpentry, but definitely something that we share in common with the Moravian Church. So in 1842 and after, the decision was made because of a testimony through Christian Metz to immigrate to the United States, and eventually they purchased a tract of 5,000 acres outside of Buffalo, New York, called Ebenezer. And these are 2 parts of 2 wonderful sketches of Middle Ebenezer, which unfortunately are lost. They appeared in a book published by Frank Lankus in 1949. Nobody knows where they are now. But fortunately, we have these pictures of them, and they show the village. They do not show the meeting house. What they do show right here is the woolen mill. There's, I think, the fire watchtower. The rest of these are buildings for residences. This is the abutment for the bridge across Buffalo Creek. And this is where they had, what, about 25 feet of snow a month ago. In Ebenezer, they built their very first purpose-built meeting rooms, meeting houses. And very importantly, it is a meeting house. It's not a kiosk. It's not referred to as a church. It's a Versammlungssaal, or place to gather for worship. They all feature a traditional queen post roof truss. It's right above us where we are right now. That's the two posts here with the cross beam and then the joist supporting it, and so on off to the side. And this allows for this very large open space without any interior supports. You will not see a support column. This wall is non-load bearing. It's also quite rickety, but it's not load bearing. And so these are very large open spaces. So they were using some fairly advanced building technology to build these meeting houses. And as I like to point out to a friend of mine who is a Shaker scholar, our meeting houses are bigger than the Shaker meeting houses, and they're better. But they're much bigger. In fact, we believe, although we're still researching this, so far as I know, the building you're sitting in right now is the largest worship space constructed by an American communal society in the 19th century. 150 feet roughly long and about 30 feet wide. Very, very large space. So we start with the middle Ebenezer Saal. We have two pictures of it. It actually is still standing. This is the west side of it. This is the women's entrance. And you can see it's a little different than the meeting houses we have here. And there's a central door. The women would have gone in. And on the other side, presumably, is the men's entrance. This is a side view of that same building that is from a map, which interestingly is also lost. But we have this wonderful photograph of it, and that shows that it looked very much like the building here in Amana. Later on, this was sold to a Catholic congregation, and it's now the 14 Holy Helpers Catholic Church. It is a little bit different than when we were there. There's a plaque outside, which I think is, I was going to kick out this because it says site of original Middle Ebenezer Church. It actually is, the walls are the original walls. They end about here. And you can see that on the outside. They basically raised the roof, added a tower to the front, and added the sacristy on the back. So that building is still in use, although right now buried under several feet of snow. They built another building at Nida Ebenezer, Lower Ebenezer. There's some pictures here of that building. This is a detail from a drawing by either Joseph Prestole or Friedrich Jeck. We're not sure who did this, but this shows that meeting house. You can see very much like here in Amana. And then I've got a photograph here from about 1900, which shows it when it was a Methodist congregation. And there is the bell tower that they added, but otherwise it's still very much like one of our buildings. And this is a frame building. The two meeting houses we know of in Ebenezer were frame buildings. Otherwise, they're always built out of brick and stone. This is the side view of the building showing the bell tower. And this is a picture of it. Unfortunately, it stood until 1961, and then it was torn down and they built a modern church on the side. Upper Ebenezer, we really don't know too much about. This is a detail of another one of these hand-drawn maps. We believe this building right where my pointer is right now is the meeting house, but I'm not quite sure. There's very little left of Upper Ebenezer if you've been there. It's just a tiny little town. It's called Blossom, New York. They do have a very nice sign at the cemetery, which mentions the Ebenezer Society. And supposedly, the reason why I think it's this building here, supposedly this building, which stands in roughly that place and is a church, was built using the foundation of the Upper Ebenezer Meeting House. Canada and New Ebenezer and Kenneburg we know nothing about. These were all villages that were fairly small. They had about 100 people or less in them, so think East Amana, West Amana. These are pictures of some of the buildings there. Then the move came to Iowa. Well, before we talk about that, I want to point out some other meeting spaces that were built about the same time by other communal groups in the United States, just for point of comparison. This is the Great Feast Hall at Economy, Pennsylvania, near Pittsburgh. That was built by the Harmony Society. Harmony Society, kind of similar to us in some ways. Again, a pietist sect, although they were completely celibate and eventually just kind of died out completely. This is their big feast hall. This is actually smaller than this building that you're in now. This is a shaker, one of those tiny little shaker meeting houses. This is at Watervliet, New York. This is the church at Economy. And then in the lower right, we have another one of those shaker meeting houses at Pleasant Hill, Kentucky. Again, most of these spaces, plain benches, most of them originally faced the long wall as we do. You'll see that in Quaker meeting houses too. And I like to say that's because that way you're very close to the person presiding over the church service. And there's no grand processional aisle, so it's not very fancy or anything like that. And finally, we have the little meeting room at Ephrata, Pennsylvania, which is a little bit different than ours. It's a perfect cube, 40 feet square. And the person presiding over the worship service would stand right by the center column in the middle of that and lead the worship. The first saal built in Amana was the Lauer Saal, so-called after Heinrich Lauer, who lived there in later years. It was a beautiful stone building. It stood just to the east of this building, and of course in 1937, I think it was, it burned down, and in those days there was no thought of trying to save the ruins. They just took it down, and the building stone was reused. The second one was the Große Versammlungssaal, where we are right now in Amana. 14 windows long, 150 feet in total. There's actually a drawing here that shows it in 1874. These two photos are both from the 1930s. Of course, men entering from one side, women entering from another. And you may, there is, I finally figured out there's a pattern to which is the men's side and which is the women's side. If you think of what is the front of each meeting house, whether it actually faces the street or not, but the side that we regard as the front, the men always enter on the right and the women always enter on the left, except in High Amana, which is weird. Well, not you know, one door in High, so it's a little bit different. But the men always enter on the right, the women always enter on the left. So this is the front of this building. Homestead faces, this faces south, Homestead faces north, but in both cases the men are on the right side. The interior of this building, you don't need to see these pictures because that's where you are right now. They would also build several small little meeting rooms in each village. Main Amana had 4 of them. These are the places where those evening prayer services were held for the total of 11 church services. This is what is now was the Rudy Kellenberger house in West Amana, the little Salzman that was in there, the tiny little church room. And then I don't know why I didn't do these in chronological order. Here's East Amana. 1871 was a big year for building these buildings. High Amana was built in 1858 and is the oldest of all the meeting houses and that are still standing. And the most unusual, didn't say weird, most unusual in that there was only ever one entrance. And the men just literally walked across the room over to their side of of the room. So that building does not follow that rule of the men entering on the right. And of course, that's now the Arts Guild headquarters. West Amana was built in 1871, and there's a kind of a funny story. They built 3 of these buildings in 1871, East Amana, West Amana, and South Amana. And there are 2 stories about the West Amana South. The first one is that supposedly when they were building West Amana, they had a pile of building stone that they set aside for that building, strictly for the South. And you'll notice in no other Amana building is the stonework that even. It's almost like bricks. Those stones in the West Amana South are almost exactly the same size. And like all of the 1871 buildings, it had a wooden partition wall on one side only. East has a partition wall, and South Amana all have partition walls. They were all the same design. But there is one difference between West and South. Supposedly, the South Amana building went up first, and they had the stakes set out for the West Amana one, and in the dead of night, the guys from South Amana ran up to West and moved the stakes in slightly so that their building would be smaller. I have not confirmed this, but that's the story. There's meeting house envy there. And then, of course, this is South Amana, which possibly is a little bit bigger than West is. And then finally, Homestead, I saved the best for last. Built in 1865 to 1866. First used for a service on May the 13th, 1866. We know that specific date because thankfully Christian Metz gave a testimony, and so it was recorded that he was there because it was the very first service. So we know when that was first used. And the same is true for Amana. It doesn't say in the records that this building was built, but we do know that Christian Metz was here, and he gave a testimony, I think it was Christmas Eve, 1864, so we have a date. The pictures here are the oldest photographs of any of these meeting houses. Were taken about 1890, and they are at the State Historical Society in Iowa City. And this shows the interior of the Homestead building, and those weird bricked over windows on the edge of the Homestead building were there from early on. So they made that addition for the men's entrance very early on. And this is, of course, the highly attractive Homestead meeting house. And, that whole idea of constructing these long buildings with great big windows for natural light carried over into the 1930s when we were building the auditorium for the Amana High School. We did not have an architect for that. Carl Flick drew this sketch of what it would look like, which they ran in the bulletin so that people would know what was going to happen and why there was a bond issue. And then they just built it. But they went for that style that they'd always had. They didn't look to the outside world. They built yet another meeting house, if you will, in 1935. Oh, and then Middle. Well, I had to tuck them in. This picture of Middle, again, probably in the turn of the century. You can see the porch is not there on the women's side. If you ever wondered, Middle has unusually high windows in the basement where the food pantry is now. That's because that's where the print shop was. So the print shop started out in that basement. You need a lot of light when you're doing composition. And then it moved out in 1880-81. And there are some pictures of Middle, which of course is the building we use most often nowadays. And I originally did this presentation in 2020, and so I ended with this slide that talked about the way we were coping with COVID-19. So, if you talk about the evolution of church services and meeting spaces. But essentially what we have is a very plain meeting space with an emphasis on the word that is spoken, the worship that goes on there, not with any ceremony. Very, very stripped down. They've never been more ornamented than they are today. They've always looked the same on the inside, other than the addition of electrical lights. And they're still in use here 150 years later. And so I'll finish up so you can get back to the Super Bowl. Yes?
One question. When do you think they quit tearing down this inside wall for communion?
Up until 28.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because 28 was the last Liebesmahl before the change.
Okay.
And so, yeah, so these walls, you can't now, they're fixed in place, but you used to be able to take them down, and you can see the holes up there. They would put them on sawhorses, and they'd use metal pins to hold them in the sawhorses, and then these were the tables that they sat at for communion. And this is strictly only for communion and for really big funerals. So if you were a really well-known person and they had to take the wall down for your funeral, it got noted in the history. And of course, when Christian Metz died, the walls were both down. And I wish sometimes we could do that, because I just want to see what that would look like.
Yeah. Now, I read also that simultaneously they conducted a funeral service for Christian Metz
In the other villages, yeah.
So when you think about it, then that was really quite a...
Well, that was the can't miss event of 1867. You had to be at the same thing. I think the same thing is true for London.
Of what?
For London. For Barnum.
I don't remember that.
Okay. Yeah.
I think it's interesting, all of those, when they did the Liebesmahl tables, they always used linen tablecloth.
Mm-hmm.
And when we were cleaning out the high church, preparatory to it becoming the Arts Guild, I remember as they kind of, in High Amana, Uncle Glenn organized it, and Henry, and you had to come and help. And we opened up a shrine in the basement, and here, well, actually Minnie Setzer's apartment, here were all the linen tablecloths for the Liebesmahl tables.
Oh, wow.
Thick, and then they all had embroidery around it. Every single one of them. Cool. Yeah.
Anything else? Yes, sir.
I saw a picture of the Amana Bolton from 1935.
Mm-hmm.
How long has it been in print?
Since 1932.
Okay.
May the 12th, 1932. So what are we on? What does that make it? It's 91st edition.
I was going to say, it just occurred to me when we were talking about this, that this is the 30th anniversary year of our English hymnal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all very much.